but I think it's time for me to thank you all. My name is Zach Koda. I'm a teacher naturalist with North Branch Nature Center. I'm so glad you are all joining us this evening to talk about grasslands and grassland birds. It's really exciting to have you all here. This presentation is being hosted by us at North Branch, as well as Green Mountain Audubon Society. And I'll mention that the presentation is recorded. So if you have a friend that misses it, the presentation will end up on our website, so you can share it with them later on. And with that, I'm going to introduce Kevin Tolen from the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great turnout, and thanks, Zach, and Sean's in here somewhere for helping set the all up. So I know I've talked with North Branch before about bobolinks and grassland conservation, and this past fall I did a talk with Green Mountain Audubon. So I'm going to try and touch on some new points, not just be a broken record. This is going to be more focused on meadowlarks, which we don't really touch on a whole lot when we're talking about bobolinks and savanna sparrows. So I'll start with a little background info on their prairie habitat, their distribution. Then I'll shift to Vermont centric, and then some management stuff. And then I'll talk about the 2021 Blitz that BCE and New Hampshire Audubon are spearheading for this summer. Zach has his chat open. Feel free to chat him questions. He may chime in if he feels it's a good time to, or he can wait till the end or between sections, or whatever works best for him. So I also want to recognize that, Vermont is the ancestral land of the Abenaki. They were the first land managers here, and a lot of my work now with grassland birds is about management. So I think it's really important to recognize, management's been happening here for long before it's been colonized, and I want to recognize that we are on their land doing management. So when people think of grasslands, they think of Kansas, they think of the tall grass prairie in Minnesota. They don't think about Vermont. But they also don't think about the places out west that have a lot of grassland habitat. The rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains creates some pretty large expanses of habitat. The Palouse grasslands up here, more rain shadows in the valley and foothill grasslands, but none really over in Vermont. That being said, we have a lot of similar species in our hayfields in Vermont. This image on the left from the Missouri Department of Conservation has bobolink, has northern harrier. I think that's an upland sandpiper back here. This is one of the many grassland sparrows. So a lot of similarities in the fauna. And so even though the native prairies are all Midwest in the West, meadowlark extend well into the east, into Maine, southern Canada. But they also breed all the way down in the grasslands in northern South America. So they have a very wide, type of habitat selection. In Vermont, we think of them in our hayfields, but out west, we had someone calling in from Arizona. They're down here nesting in the Chihuahuan Desert. That's a whole subspecies, almost full species, the Lillian's meadowlark. And it spans many different grassland biomes and many different states. And so habitat in Vermont is going to look a lot different than habitat down in the Chihuahuan Desert. And even within New England, habitat can differ a lot. In Maine, where there are a lot of blueberry barrens, you'll find upland sandpipers and meadowlarks and savanna sparrows in those blueberry barrens. Here, we don't have quite as many blueberry barrens, and they're smaller, which definitely plays a huge role in it. But we don't think of them as something you'd see in a barren type environment. We think of, Shelburne Farm or, Rutland and Addison counties, right? But they do have within their range, a pretty wide, habitat selection. One thing that a lot of people remember about bobolinks is their insane migration. They go down from New Hampshire and Vermont and New York, all the way down to the southern end of South America, to those grasslands, and return every single winter. Meadowlarks don't make that same epic migration. This is some research done by my colleague Jason Hill at UVM, at VCE, and Roz, who's Roz Renfrew, one of the VCE co-founders. They found that depending where you are and depending on the individual they tagged, they had much different migratory pathways. Over here, orange is fall migration, green is spring migration. Short distant migrant, 300 kilometers. This guy was a mid-distant migrant, 1,400-ish kilometers. But there were also 2 resident birds in Maryland, which is really interesting that they have such a diverse strategy of overwintering versus migrating. Of course, there are definitely benefits to overwintering. You don't have to waste energy migrating. You're on the mating grounds earlier in the season, so you have a leg up on establishing territory. But if you don't migrate, it's going to be colder in the winter. That's going to take more energy to get through. You have to build up your fat reserves. There may not be as much food available in the winter. So it's just a really interesting kind of dynamic that they have a very variable strategy of migration. One other thing I want to touch on is the difference between Eastern and Western meadowlarks. They were the same species up until the early 1910s, and then they were split. The song and range are by far the best ways to tell them apart. But if you do get a really good look at them, you kind of want to look right at the cheek. It's called the malar. The Eastern meadowlark here has a white malar, and the Western has a yellow malar. And these 2 species do hybridize. It's rare, and the offspring have they have reduced viability and reproductive output and potential. But there's a large zone of hybridization. This whole western area, Midwestern area, where the Western meadowlarks in pink and the Eastern meadowlarks in blue overlap. It spans all the way from Arizona into Texas, into Kansas. And it's kind of right along the boundary of mixed grass and short grass prairies. A lot for at least the Midwestern section. Obviously in the South, it's gonna be more desert, so things aren't quite the same. I'll touch on meadowlarks in Vermont specifically a little bit more. I mentioned they have a pretty wide range of habitats within their breeding ground. But within Vermont, the Vermont breeding ground, same thing with New Hampshire breeding ground, and most of the surrounding area, down into Massachusetts as well, is that they need hay fields. So I'll focus more on New England specific biology now. They will overwinter down in southern New England, along the coast primarily, a bit inland in Massachusetts. And something that's really interesting about their overwintering habitat is that it's limited by temperature. They won't winter in areas where the average January temperature is below 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That was kind of found out using a lot of breeding bird, Christmas bird count records, which is something that I think a lot of people here have participated in the past or are active participants. But that, of course, is going to exclude basically all of Vermont, because there's nowhere in Vermont where the temperature in January averages above 15 degrees Fahrenheit. In the future, it'll be interesting to see as the climate changes and fluctuates, how that northward, how the wintering range will extend northward, if it will, or if there are other elements of the habitat that wouldn't be suitable for them. In Vermont and New Hampshire, the sightings are all heavily centered in the areas with grassland. In Vermont, that's the Champlain Valley. That's some areas up near Newport, some areas along the Connecticut River. Obviously, the yellow is hay. And over here, the bigger circles mean more records in eBird. So generally hotspots, eBird hotspots have those larger circles. And then over in New Hampshire, it's a lot more localized. We have a pretty large range of grassland habitat here. In New Hampshire, they're pretty much all limited to airports throughout, but there's no big conglomerated areas of hay. So that's why, Vermont's gonna have a little bit harder of a time than New Hampshire with a Meadowlark survey, just because of that fact that they're not as localized as sites. So why am I focusing so hard on Meadowlarks this year? For one, they're recently listed in New Hampshire. So, we're pretty close to them, and they're going to be listed in Vermont more than likely this year. So, now is really the time we need to act. Additionally, grassland birds are undergoing the sharpest decline of any group of species in the continental North America. And meadowlarks in particular, this graphic on the left, set 3 and 4 meadowlarks have been lost in the past 50 years. It's 75% population decline, which is incredibly not sustainable for a population. When I go back to this graph or this map, in this area right here, this Kansas, Oklahoma area, which is kind of right in the heartland of their habitat. It's right in that hybridization zone. It's a big amount of habitat, big part of the population. There's less than a 25% chance that that population is sustainable into the future. It's declining, I think, 17% a year in this area. In Vermont, we're declining by 8.7% a year for meadowlark populations, which is still massive, but it's not just a Vermont problem. So even though when I show those maps of the prairie ecosystems, they're all out west, even though they're in Vermont, we still can and should do our part to try and preserve them. I've talked about how land management is really vital to these grassland birds, especially in these states. And a big part of that is because the natural landscape is primarily forest dominated. These are just relative abundances of wildlife in New England in the past 400 years. Right around European settlement, of course, the forest dips down to a very low level as the land is cleared for agriculture and sheep, which is then dairy. The wolf is lost from the landscape. Beavers are lost in the landscape. Deer are almost lost in the landscape. And while all these forest creatures and the forest landscape has taken a huge hit, the bobolink and meadowlark are peaking for their Vermont New England population. And that's drastically declined in the 1900s as the land has been more forested. Got a question to define what listed means. Listed just means it's considered either threatened or endangered. There are 2 types of listing, federal and state endangerment. Federal is if they're endangered on the whole range at a federal level, which they are. Meadowlarks are threatened on a huge scale scale like that, but not in a legal term. When it's listed as threatened, it gets certain legal protections, and it's a legislative process. So it's kind of a political thing, so it's kind of hard to get some species passed as listed. So in Vermont, where it's going to be state listed, means that on the state scale, it's at an imminent risk of being lost from the state if measures aren't taken. And then after threatened, you have endangered, which means it's very, very close to being lost from the state, which actually goes really well into my next slide, our grassland birds in Vermont. Some of these are more common and recognizable than others. Bobolink and Savannah sparrow are pretty widely, relatively speaking, widely distributed. You can see that bobolink's declining almost 3% in Vermont per year, not quite as bad as the eastern meadowlark, but still that's an alarming rate. Savannah sparrow aren't necessarily declining, they're kind of stagnant, but that could also just be an artifact of the survey methods we use. So I'd still be concerned about them. And then other species that just are very seldom seen. Grasshopper sparrow, you got to go up to the Franklin County Airport. Upland sandpiper, you got to go up to Gore Road. If they're still even going to be nesting there this year, I don't believe nesting for uppies was confirmed last year. And then you have species like Henslow Sparrow. I don't know anybody that has Henslow Sparrow on their Vermont list. There's no breeding records since the 70s and 80s. You know, it's just not, if it's on the Vermont landscape, it's not observed ever breeding anymore. And then when you look at their legal protections, you can kind of see what that means a little bit better. You know, Henslow Sparrow was listed decades ago. Unfortunately, I believe it has been completely lost from the Vermont landscape, at least for breeding, unless there's some really small scattered groups somewhere. Sedge wrens, maybe a couple pairs here will breed during the really wet years. You know, not a ton, but they're out there. Still definitely rare. An upland sandpiper, one, maybe two nesting pairs in the entire state. That's the level of endangerment that these guys are in Vermont. Grasshopper sparrow are considered threatened. There's still 25 nesting pairs, maybe, across 2 sites. Maybe, you know, scattered breeding elsewhere, but not, you know, large populations. So they're listed as threatened. And that's the same level of legal protection that meadowlarks are up for, and I believe are going to be listed as. Vesper sparrows are potentially going to be listed as threatened in New Hampshire in the upcoming years. I'm not too hopeful about that happening in Vermont, but that's another species that I think is in the discussion for listing. Bobolinks, you know, even though they're declining really quickly, they still have a long way to go before they're listed at all. And why are they getting listed as threatened? The graph on the right shows just how insane of a population crash these guys have had. Since 1960s, when formalized surveys began, they have basically dropped to 0 abundance in Vermont on the breeding bird survey routes. There are a couple spikes, which is really interesting. I don't 100% have a reason for that. My educated guess is that that was a crisis. That was a farm crisis, kind of similar to the one that's going on right now. And so dairy prices absolutely plummeted. So likely it wasn't financially viable or didn't make financial sense to mow hayfields. So there could have just been more delay mode, non-mowed parcels of habitat, which might have helped boost their populations a little bit. But that's like all speculation. I don't know if that's a direct cause or approximate cause or anything like that. Question about how they're doing in Quebec. Also pretty bad. They have been listed in Quebec. So of our neighboring states, they've been listed, or neighboring political entities, they've been listed in New Hampshire and Quebec. I think they're up for listing in Massachusetts, but I'm not 100% sure on their status there. And then they're not listed in New York yet because you know, a whole lot of northwestern New York along the Great Lakes that's a lot of grasslands. So like they still have a pretty sizable population out near Lake Erie. But this like on the left graph, this is, you know, range wide meadowlark declines. So even when I say they're doing well in New York, that's extremely relative to elsewhere. Every 25 years, there's a breeding bird atlas in Vermont. The blue squares on the left show blocks, as they're called, where meadowlarks were confirmed breeding during the first breeding bird atlas in 1976 to 81. On the right with the orange blocks, that's the most recent breeding bird atlas from 03 to 07. I'm sure people here participated in that atlas. You know, there's a big loss in blocks. When you overlay the two, there are a lot of blue blocks from the first atlas that did not any documented breeding in the second atlas. You know, not as much in the Champlain Valley. Actually, there's more blocks in the Champlain Valley that have breeding records of meadowlark, but the entire, you know, upper valley throughout much of the non-Champlain Valley, there were lots of blocks where there was no breeding records. And if there was this significant of a change, I think it was a 55% decline in block numbers. You know, in 2032, what are the meadowlark, you know, what are those records going to look like in 25 years, 12 years from now, if they've been, you know, this significant and the population decline is only getting more and more severe? We can't really wait to know what their distribution for breeding is until the next breeding bird atlas. I'll take a quick break now. I'm going to just touch on some habitat management stuff, and then I will talk about the Blitz itself, about you know, methods and why and how and what. Zach, did any questions come rolling in, or any comments, criticisms?
You know, the couple questions I have, I think you're about to answer in this habitat section. So specifically, I think folks are curious about how maybe not all open land is created equal.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's I mean, that is so true. Like even in you have two 25-hectare grasslands. When you walk through them, the hay composition is so different in each one. You know, not just species, but like the form it takes and how it grows, and you know, the flower communities are different, or there's different wet sections and hills that have different communities, like on microhabitats. So yeah, they definitely aren't all equal. You know, the biggest thing is going to be size. You know, 5 hectares is minimum for a meadowlark. That's about 10 football fields. So, you know, it's no great plains, but it's still a significant chunk of area. When you think of, you know, bobolinks, they can go a little bit smaller, down to like the 4-3 hectare minimum. A lot of that is because, you know, their native habitat is the Midwest. So they want to find habitat that is similar to that, that emulates that. And a big part of that is the openness. You know, if you're ever in a big field, you know, I think walking to the woods, it's kind of jarring. It's like, well, I went from being able to see 3 miles around me to the woods. And there's a lot of research, not as much with meadowlarks, but with bobolinks and savanna sparrows, that it's a perception of openness that they really like. So if you have, you know, a field that is, you know, 2 fields, same size, same shape, and one of them is, you know, on a gentle hill, while the other one is, you know, completely flat, they may prefer the gentle hill toward the top because they're at a higher elevation. So they have more of a view shed and it's more open. So like this here was on a little bit of an incline, but it's right on Lake Champlain. So you have a view shed of, you know, 5, 10 plus miles. So that's why, you know, not the entire reason, but I think that's, you know, one reason why, you know, Lake Champlain has so many great grassland habitats and hotspots around it. You know, Shelburne Farm is fantastic. They have, you know, multiple meadowlark pairs. You know, they're great with management. That's where a lot of this research on bobolinks and savanna sparrows has been done. And like, this is why, because it's absolutely gorgeous habitat. One other thing that matters a lot is landscape configuration. You know, if you have 2 fields about the same size, about the same shape, but this one is surrounded by trees, it's not going to feel open. But if you're a bird looking at the landscape scale, you know, not the local scale of, okay, what's the percent of grass to woody vegetation in this field? If you're looking at the big scale, you're not going to see one small field. You're going to see this whole thing as one big unit. So just because it's a smaller field, technically, it's part of such a large complex that still has kind of like the openness that you'd find in one field that's managed by one person. And then, the last major thing I'll think of really is kind of the vegetation composition. They really do like hay. So I have a lot of people that will have, something like this on the left, where it's a really nice, big open area that's filled with ferns. Maybe the soil's a little wet, it's at a low area, or for whatever reason, there's just ferns. It was never planted with hay. That's an open area. It may be 10 hectares, but there's no grass. They're not going to nest there. That's just not suitable vegetation for them to nest in. And same with the right. It's, it looks overgrown, shrubby. There's probably some grasses mixed in, but there's a ton of forbs, which is basically anything that's not a grass is a forb. Woody vegetation, just not good. Not good. Big old X's. This is what is like the dream habitat. This is in Shelburne at Meach Cove Farms, right at the top of this massive hill. And I mean, I had to hike up this hill with mist nets weighing 20 pounds so many times, and I always hated it. But the birds absolutely loved it. It's such an amazing view shed. It's surrounded by other fields. Yes, there's a slight hedgerow here. But you can see over that, you're uphill, and also they'll use that. They'll perch on it to sing. So it's not maybe ideal, but that's definitely tolerable. And with the habitat is on such a diverse spectrum. So if you have really perfect, it's on a slight hill, good view shed, and it's a huge field, and the grass is awesome. Those small things like the hedgerow won't matter. So it is kind of like but it's a recipe, really. It's have the right amount of grass along with the right size field, along with the right habitat configuration. It's really variable, and there can be a lot of different things that will mess up a field and make things not breed in it. But I'd say that it's very rarely one thing, unless it's like, only 1 acre or there's zero grass. For most hay fields, it's somewhere on that spectrum, depending on like a mix of all the different factors. Threats and management. I only have a couple slides on this because I know that this is what I talk about at basically every grassland presentation. But one of the major threats is intensive haying. Back in the 1800s, when sheep were the valuable commodity for agriculture, they didn't need to hay too much. Sheep don't need the same nutrient value, especially proteins, that healthy dairy cattle need. So as the agricultural economy shifted from sheep to cattle, to dairy cattle specifically, which is the vast majority of Vermont's agricultural outputs, they needed to cut more frequently. And this is really exemplified in this graph to the left. So this is like the days since the field was cut. 28 days since the field was cut for the first time this year. And it has a relative feed value, which is just like how nutrient rich and how good the feed is, of 160. If you wait a week, you lose like 1/10 of the nutrient value. If you wait 2 weeks, you lose 1/5 of it. So if you need really high quality hay because you have a bunch of really healthy, really nicely producing female cows, and you make really nice cheeses, and you need really nice, good quality feed, it's literally not possible to delay more than a certain amount. And then also, if you're selling hay to sell to those dairy farmers, you also can't afford to take a hit in the nutrient value. And so 28 days for that rotation, which in the Champlain Valley, depending on the type of farm, if it's organic or if it's an industrial or size or anything like that, is kind of reasonable. I'd say maybe a month long rotation So maybe the 30, 45 day rotation would be a little bit more reasonable depending on the year. That's a sizable amount of time. That's 3 hayings a summer maybe. That's still not nearly enough time for birds. Birds need 65 days to really be able to breed between cuttings. So by that point, the nutrient value for the hay is just so low, too low for dairy cattle unless using it for bedding. So it's hard to make a profit as a dairy farmer if you're not cutting at the right times, because you have to buy food from elsewhere, which is extremely expensive. And that's still probably coming from grassland bird habitat elsewhere. So it's still a net zero almost. So the hard and fast rule in Vermont and New Hampshire is August 1st for your first cut. Depending where you are, you could maybe cut before June 1st and then wait 65 days. And that would put you kind of into early mid-August. That's not possible elsewhere, or not possible everywhere. In the Champlain Valley, that's possible. But if you're in Newport, your growing season starts later. The nutrient value in the soil might not be, as great for growing as it is in the Champlain Valley. It's colder. So, either you won't have time to be able to do that 65-day gap between harvests, or the grass doesn't have enough time to regenerate to a height that would be of use for breeding grassland birds. So it's such a complex, economic, ballet almost, especially during these times of farm crisis where, farms really aren't doing well. They definitely, if they couldn't afford to delay mow in past years, they definitely can't do it this year, which is, really unfortunate. And it's something I always want to make sure that I clarify that, farmers are doing it because that's what they have to do. They don't hate the birds and they're not bad people. And though a lot of them love the birds, and, I'll work with them to find the best area of habitat on their field and try and delay what they can where it'll have the best, most positive impact. But that's just the way that the agricultural, landscape is in Vermont right now. It's so dairy focused. There's not a whole ton of, other ways around it if you are a dairy farmer. Zach, you could hit me with that question.
Yeah, so I'm hearing you talk about farming and the link between evolving agricultural practices and grassland bird conservation. I grew up on a small dairy farm in the Champlain Valley that couldn't make it economically, like so many farms are struggling with. And so I'm just thinking, as someone who likes to eat dairy products, Audubon has a great bird-friendly maple product, and we hear a lot about bird-friendly coffee. Do you know of any programs that can allow folks that eat dairy products to sort of use their dollars to invest in farms and farmers that are doing great jobs in conservation?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because I like bird-friendly. There's a study that came out recently on the impact that bird-friendly coffee has compared to just organic or shade grown. And birders are going to be more likely to, or at least, bird-minded people. Everyone loves bird. No one hates birds except for maybe my sister or something like that. So I think that would definitely be a big help for farms to put added value into their products, which is what a lot of the smaller farms are doing now. They're switching from selling raw dairy, raw milk, to selling value-added products like cheeses or any other dairy product. There is something like that with grazing out in the Midwest. Audubon has a big incentive out west for bird-friendly grazing. This came from Audubon. They also have a bunch of priority areas out west. So this dark green here is considered a priority area for future conservation for grassland birds. This lighter green is like currently habitat, but not priority. For milk in Vermont, that is not a thing, but it's something that definitely I am very interested in exploring, because I've kind of thought similar about, you know, ducks, like Ducks Unlimited. They had such a fantastic impact for waterfowl. If you look at this graph that has the grassland birds down here, the only group that's like, you know, definitely increasing are wetlands, which are, you know, a lot of the ducks and stuff. You know, and it'd be great if we could get some of that, you know, awareness and momentum going for grassland birds to either, you know, subsidize farmers that may have like really good habitat or rare breeding birds there, and subsidize them to be able to purchase from elsewhere, or do these value added things such as, you know, Vermont Audubon, you know, they have like, you know, Vermont Audubon has their bird friendly maple, you know, Audubon bird friendly milk or bird friendly dairy. I mean, it's such a great idea, and such a, you know, it's something that I think has a lot of potential, especially with the rate that the grassland birds are going now. And you know, if we raise the awareness, I think that it would have a great outcome. And then, like all species, habitat loss, huge. Again, this is that great grassland in Shelburne. As you know, the dairy industry struggles, there's more of an incentive for changes in land use. You know, you could transition it to a row crop or development or anything that's not hay, which is really bad in areas like Vermont, because once it's no longer a grassland, it's never going to be a grassland again. Except for maybe some rare circumstances with row crops, and they might switch cover crop type every so often. As soon as it's sold to a developer, it's being subdivided up. I mean, how much money would people pay for a house with this view, especially now with Vermont's real estate boom, right? And they're so area sensitive that it's integral that you keep those large habitat blocks together, which is why, you know, habitat loss is especially an issue for these area sensitive birds, similar to some of our forest birds, like, you know, wood thrushes that are really area sensitive. You know, they can't handle that fragmentation, because it's not just habitat degradation, it's habitat loss. It's not, no way even viable. And this is really exemplified both in Vermont and elsewhere. This tallgrass prairie, all this tan color was native tallgrass prairie and is no longer. That's states and states worth of lost habitat out there. And in the Vermont, this is the acres of farmland grazed. So it went from, you know, 280,000, then dropped over 100,000 acres to 158,000 in just 20 years. You know, recently the state came out with an incredible agricultural report for the next 10 years of Vermont agriculture, which is where a lot of these numbers are coming from. If this is something that's interested to you, I definitely would suggest giving it a read. There's some really, really interesting info that I don't really have time to get into now, but like how the aging farmer population plays into all this. And, you know, so there's so much interconnection in the agricultural industry, both between, you know, between producers, and then you throw the government in there, and then you have programs like EQIP through NRCS, which are financial incentive programs. It's way too much to get into now, but if that's interested to you, it's out there, and it's a good skim, especially the dairy section. That's where I spend most of my time reading. Cool. Any more questions on management, or we can always get them at the end, but I'm gonna take a drink and then talk about the Blitz more if not.
We have one question looking for more information about resources. So a source for the info from the state report that you mentioned, and maybe we can share some other resources in the chat at the end. A question about how to go find Meadowlarks, which might, I'm guessing you're going to talk about in the Blitz part. And then Richard has a question that is similar to what I'm curious about in sort of agricultural methods and trying to tease out how do we support agricultural methods that support grassland birds, and wondering about Amish communities in Vermont maybe using traditional methods that would support grassland birds better.
Mm-hmm. Like even I don't know specifics about the Amish communities. You know, that's definitely something I need to investigate more, obviously. I need to investigate everything more. Like I need to bone up on my agricultural side stuff, everything. I know, especially people like here that have been living in Vermont for a while, like you grew up on dairy farms, you probably have a much better sense of the state of Vermont farms than I do. But like my sense would be that even though they may not be using, you know, the same combines and rakers that are being used, say, on like a conventional farm, if they're making dairy, they still need nutrient-rich hay. So even if they're using different tools or techniques, it's still going to be hayed more frequently. I'd say one caveat would be the time investment would probably be higher. So there'd be more of a chance of sections being missed in some years, which has been, you know, a historic thing with farmers that, oh, I've just never gotten a chance to mow that side until September in the past. So I've always had bobolinks there. Even if they're not, you know, meaning to manage for the bobolinks, kind of situations like that are relatively common for a lot of farmers. So that'd kind of be my guess. I'm not sure if anyone else would have any thoughts they want to mention later or in the chat, but that kind of be my intuition. Oh, and where to find meadowlarks. Yes, I'll touch on that. Yes, I did not forget that. I'll touch on that as well. So as I mentioned, VCE's teaming up with New Hampshire Audubon, and then, you know, partners like Green Mountain Audubon and North Branch. We're trying to get people out there to look for meadowlarks and try and get a sense of the management in the meadowlark habitat. So raise awareness and collect data. I'm hoping that, you know, we can collect data on, you know, the management near populations of meadowlarks, so that if we see that there's one area that has, you know, all the fields in the surrounding 2 miles are all delay mode, that would be a great spot to get in there, you know, either as a land trust or, you know, try and acquire some type of easement, or just, you know, have me reach out and just try and do some outreach and make sure they understand, you know, why their land is so valuable. You know, they have meadowlarks there, which are state listed. So, you know, try and find where time and energy can be best spent. And then also, you know, get a map of the meadowlark distribution. eBird is an incredible tool. I use it 30 times a day, at least. But there are limitations in it. You know, I'll talk about this line in a second, but people are so biased to go where meadowlarks have been seen before. You know, I know for a fact that I could go up to Gore Road and see 3 meadowlarks. And if I'm a birder that's keeping a year list, I'll look at eBird and be like, oh, meadowlark was seen there today. I'll go check it out this weekend. And then you swing by there on April 28th, you check it off your year list, and you may not go visit the grasslands again. You know, when I asked people's favorite birding spots, not one person said grassland. And I took that a little personal. That really hurt that didn't actually. But, you know, people just aren't going to go bird grasslands with the same frequency they go bird other habitats. You know, bird diversity is pretty low. There's no trees, so you're standing out in the sun. In the mid-July, that's brutal. You know, and yeah, just the low diversity. It's not the most exciting place to go bird when you could go spend your morning at G-Prags, or, go to, even go to Missisquoi. Right there. That's such a great bird. You're going to want to hit Missisquoi as well. So I really want to try and get people out to bird areas where they may not necessarily have seen meadowlarks before. So the left is Breeding Bird Atlas, the most recent one. And there are areas, along here on the Essex County border with New Hampshire that just no one, or not many people are birding there and reporting sightings to eBird. There are a couple dots in the past 10 years on eBird, but we don't know if they're still breeding there. We don't know a lot about that. There's also spots on eBird where a lot of individuals have been reported, but we don't really know, if they're breeding there or not. So the goal of this project is to try and get people to check out these spots where birds may not have been reported before. Maybe they have, but get out there and look for them. You may find that there's a population here in Randolph. These are all, dark blue priority blocks here near Randolph. You may find that there's a population in there that we didn't know about, and then we can take steps to protect it. If we don't know it's there, we can't do anything to protect it. And with them getting listed in Vermont now, that's just going to open up even more avenues for, likely will open up more avenues for funding, and also just awareness, protections, etc. The grid system is the USGS has 7.5 by 7.5 minute blocks, which is just a degree measurement. And then we took those blocks, which are actually rectangles due to the latitude we're at, or latitude and longitude we're at, and broke those into sixths. So each of these blocks is about 3 miles square, more or less. Yeah, Zach, what you got for me about your encounter?
Well, I've got a few questions here that I think you'll probably answer, but to your point about finding new places, I happened to be driving through central Vermont the other day, and I decided I had 2 different routes, and I chose to take the one that went through farmland versus through forest. I stopped on the side of the road near this pasture, got out of my car, and the first bird I heard singing was a meadowlark in a place where there's never been meadowlarks reported before. So there are definitely spots, big data gaps to fill. And for me, it's more exciting to find them in a new place than to go see a meadowlark that's been seen by a dozen birders already.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's such a good point too. It's like, a lot of times birding to eBird, you're collecting data, but it can kind of feel like, a drop in the bucket, right? You put a weird bug you found on iNaturalist, and you may be the second record in New England. And that's happened to me multiple times where I see a bug in my house, take a picture, and just no one's reported it in, the surrounding hundreds of miles. But with eBird, just so many people reporting, it's kind of, I personally find it kind of hard to feel like my data is being really, significant. But with a project like this, filling in these data holes is so important. And I think it's, if we had done this 100 years ago, upland sandpipers might still be on the landscape. It's a big might, but think of all the grassland birds that have almost been entirely lost. Now is the time to try and save this guy so he stays on this landscape. I need to hurry up a little bit, so I'm going to pause on questions for a sec. How? We're going to be doing surveys from public roads and trails. So don't worry about landowner permission and stuff, but you're not going to be able to go into the pastures themselves. And you can do that 3 times a year. So one in, starting May 15th-ish, one in May, one about a month later in June, one about a month later in July. This way, with Zach's example, is that bird just migrating through, or is there, is it going to take up territory? Even if it doesn't necessarily breed there, if there's a bird that's, staking territory, that's still incredibly valuable data to know, right? So want to see if it's there throughout the summer or only once. And then of course, it also gives you more chances to actually detect a meadowlark. Every 0.2 miles, you're gonna stop, get out of your car, stop walking, and then just do a stationary point count. 0.2 miles is nice because you can just use your car odometer for it if you need to, or of course you can get, more fancy with it. But every 0.2 miles, 10-minute stationary point count, you're gonna put it on eBird. And then hopefully many people will share it with the eBird account Grasslands. That just makes it easier for me to see what data is coming in from who and from where. So once you, so basically you're gonna go on the website, you are going to, click on one of these blocks, and you're basically able to sign up for it, register for it. Then I will touch base with you, shoot you an email, and I have these maps made up, one map for each block. And then, looking at the block, we'll be like, okay, this seems like a decent route. These are all grasslands over 10 hectares. These all have good size to them. I wouldn't bother looking at the grassland over here or right here or down here. So I will make sure that everyone will have some guidance. They know what their route is and what's the best way to do it. And then you're gonna walk your route doing your stationary point counts. Hopefully, I'm really hoping that people will take the time to just kind of note what land management is happening at each field. So, was the field, if it's June, does the field look like it hasn't been mowed? Or are there, are there hay bales that are getting stacked up? Is it corn? Is it actually corn, or is it a grassland? And then also this little star, just if you detect a meadowlark, just kind of mark off where it is. That way we have at least some sense of what field it's seen in. It doesn't have to be exact coordinates, but that way you have at least some idea. To register, just go to val.vtecostudies.org, hover over the projects, click explore and join, and then just click the survey. And then it'll open up a web page that has some options on the side. And there's a protocol button, like a protocol menu. And then there's also a registration menu. And then they'll just open up this map for you. You can see what blocks are near you, if they're priority, high or medium. And even if they're low priority, if they're near you, it'd be great if people would take them up still. That's why I included so many, is so hopefully people throughout most of the state will be close to one. If you live in the middle of Green Mountain National Forest, I'm sorry, but you're a little bit out of luck. But just there's no meadowlarks there, I can almost unequivocally say. And feel free to email me if you have any questions with registration. My email, I'll give you in a second. One more plug I want to give for my Grassland Ambassadors program. I mentioned, some farmers I've gone out to, and we'll meet with, where, check out the most bobolinks over here. This is the high part of the field. This seems like it's really the best quality grass. Delay this hilltop or something. Try and find compromises with landowners so that they can both have their goals for conservation and their goals for land use sync up. So two examples here, some Green Mountain guys on the left at Catamount Outdoor Center. They email me, they're like, hey, we're conserving this land. Do you want to come check it out? I'm like, yeah, of course. I can go back to my stomping grounds in Burlington. Of course I want to come check it out. I know it's great. They have some really good breeding action there. And we have these really neat signs as well that have some contact info and just, boom, it's a nice awareness sign. I'd rather have this in my front yard than, a politician sign, honestly. I think it's a little more fun and a little more neat. So please shoot me an email, grassland@vtecostudies.org. If you or someone else is a landowner and might be interested in just chatting about conservation, that's the same email for this project. If you have questions or issues with registration or anything else. And then on our website, we also have this nesting calendar for bobolinks, which can kind of loosely apply to meadowlarks, but not really. It applies pretty much to bobolinks and savanna sparrows. Meadowlarks, a little bit of a grain of salt. And then we also have this pamphlet online that I'm happy to mail out paper copies of that has just general recommendations and stuff for management for them. And then, VCE, feel free to subscribe to our e-news, or like it's a monthly newsletter of our goings on, or follow us on social media. Always got to put a mention in for that. So it's getting to be 7. I have nothing going on, so I'm happy to stay as long as anyone is interested in having questions. But if you start dropping out, I totally understand. I'm happy to go over any of the maps I have, or registration, or anything like that. So I'm happy to do whatever people find the most beneficial.
Kevin, thank you so much for teaching us all about grassland bird ecology, and for the intersection with agriculture, and about this amazing new effort to help collect some data that hopefully is going to be used to make some really positive changes for grassland birds. And I'm getting a lot of people saying thank you via the chat. I'd love to pose a few questions that folks have. We'll start with a couple ecology questions and move toward the project specific questions.
Yeah,
so one question just is about meadowlarks. Can you tell us more about how to identify them, not just by sight, but also by sound? Are there vocalizations we should be tuning our ears to this time of year?
Yeah, totally. So like for ID, if you see one, you're gonna know it. They're like the size of a pigeon, so they're relatively large. They have that really vibrant yellow breast, which yellow-bellied chats might have, but not much else to get confused with. And they display very prominently. So you'll often see them posted up on a fence post or telephone wire, or a shrub. So you can get really, really good looks at them. So appearance hopefully won't be too much of an issue. Because like I said, like there is the Western meadowlark, but they don't overlap anywhere near here. So I wouldn't even really concern myself with those. Their song is also very recognizable. And it's loud. They sing it frequently, and they sing it from prominent perches, so the sound travels. And I'll pull up the song on my phone, and hopefully it will play. Yeah, there we go. Did that get through? I'm gonna assume it did. So it's a really whistled, it's a gorgeous whistled song. The mnemonic is spring of the year. It's like spring of the year. So that's what you listen for. Like they don't have really distinctive calls or anything like that. I'd say the biggest clues for ID are going to be habitat. You may see these guys near red-winged blackbirds, but red-winged blackbirds are going to be a little bit smaller. They're going to lack that yellow breast, or the majority of them, unless you have a very, very colorful female. And that's the yellow lores, which is kind of like the eyebrow right here. So habitat, the only thing you get them confused with would be red-winged blackbirds, but hopefully you'll be able to see these field marks, the yellow. But I'd say the song is going to be the way that most people will ID them. They're going to be in a large field, probably relatively near the interior. They're not as edge avoidant as bobolinks are, so they will be seen close to the edges. But they'll still be in the grassland. What usually happens for me is I'll hear them singing, and then I'll just look around a little bit, and then 100 yards away or 50 yards away or whatever, it just perched up on a fence post. So I usually hear them first and then scan around, and then they're usually somewhere pretty prominent. Is that good? I think
Yeah,
I covered the ID points.
and
Zach might have some.
you just perfectly described my encounter on Tuesday. I pulled over next to this field. I got out of my car and I heard that really sweet whistled song from across this open field. And I looked up with my binoculars, and there on the one tree that was out in this field, the solo tree in the middle of the field, there was this bright yellow spot on top, and that was the meadowlark. Luckily, it was facing me, so I could see that beautiful bright yellow. So Jenny's asking, when's the most likely time of the day to see and hear meadowlarks? When should folks go out doing the survey and looking for them?
Yeah, great point. We've decided survey should occur between 5 a.m. and 9 a.m. Grassland birds, I've noticed in particular, are very early risers. When I was working on Shelburne doing bobolink banding and stuff, our day would start at 4 for banding. And that would be like, we'd have the nets set up at 4, which is still pitch black out. And the birds would start flying in the pitch black morning around the head. Like I said, people don't like spending too much time birding in grasslands in mid-July because it's so hot. Birds don't really like that either. So they'll be up and about, in the morning when it's cooler. But then once the sun hits and they can't go in shade, they just kind of settle down into the grasses, get right on the ground, and will sit on their nest, either incubating or shading the chicks and eggs, or they're just hanging low, trying to find shade in the hay. So definitely early morning, as early as you can stomach, is what I would suggest.
And another ecology, biology question about fidelity, which is, are birds returning to the same site year after year? Are they returning to the same site that they fledged from?
Yes, with the caveat. Bobolinks and savanna sparrows, we know a ton about this, thanks to the work at Shelburne. We know that the offsprings usually, stay within, a kilometer of their natal field, but adults between breeding seasons usually nest within 100 meters of the same spot they nested within the same field. Meadowlarks, it's a little bit harder because their numbers in Vermont are much smaller. And the way that these things are determined are you catch a bird in the breeding ground and you put a colored band on its ankle. It flies home or flies down south for the winter, flies wherever it goes for the winter, comes back up, and you have to re-catch that bird, read the ring, and you're like, oh, it's this same bird. Or like what they did for this study, they put little light sensors on their backs. They can determine the latitude and longitude using the photo period. But I think that those were they have a couple different options now, like GPS and stuff. I've been more and more prevalent. But the odds of the bird, the odds of the bird surviving that in general, isn't zero. It's high, but there's still a low likelihood, especially if you're hatching natal birds. So if you have 3 birds in a nest, you hatch them all, they fly south. The odds of all those birds returning alive and then being able to recapture all those birds is relatively low. And so in Vermont on our landscape, where you might have a field with 100 nesting bobolink and 2 nesting meadowlark, at that point, it's just a numbers game. The odds of, just the numbers, like if you ban 200 bobolinks, you're going to get some back, just you have to. If you banned 4 meadowlarks, you may not get any back. You probably won't get any back. I would be shocked if you got back them. Where they're doing the research in Shelburne, they don't even tag meadowlarks. They'll put the bands on, but they don't use the light level geolocators they use for bobolinks and stuff, primarily because it'd be a waste of money. You'd be putting a receiver out, an expensive piece of electronics out, on a bird that you have a very, very low likelihood of ever catching again. So in some examples like these in the West, yes, they did return. However, this hasn't been done in Vermont. It's been done on military bases in southern New England. So I don't know really with meadowlarks. I'd say it's a safe assumption that they do return to the vicinity of their field, just based on, I think, all the birds in this study did. But that also could be because we're only looking for where they were released initially. So we're just biasing our results because for all we know, 1 returned, but 3 went over to, Wisconsin or Illinois or whatever. So that's a very long roundabout question to yes, but actually maybe not.
And the exciting thing with technology in conservation biology is that we're getting better tools and they're becoming less expensive. So there's a new technology called MODIS out there where you can sort of track the movements of animals using a pretty small tag that's pretty darn cheap, and you don't have to recover it to get the data. So these days, another research program might be able to answer some of these questions with new technologies, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, just touch on MODIS quickly too. I'm so excited for that. So it's basically a series of like sensor towers, and if the bird with one of these tags flies within several kilometers of the tower, it's pinged, and at least it passed by. Recently, there has been a massive grant to set up tens and tens of these towers in parallel lines across Vermont. So VC actually has a blog post about it. If you're interested in something like that and hosting it on your property, go check that out and put your name in the ring. But I can't express how excited I am for those to get in place.
Yeah, it's an awesome project that will allow biologists to get a tremendous amount of information on all sorts of animals, everything from owl migration to grassland birds coming back, and help us figure out when these birds are moving and are they coming back to the same places. So the technology is getting better, which is exciting. Question about predators that these grassland birds might be facing.
Yeah, so adults, the usual suspects, falcons, hawks. Peregrine falcons aren't generally found in grassland environments just because there's not usually the cliffs around there. But I mean, with pears at red rocks, perhaps, or they're stranger things have happened. But yeah, just normal predatory birds. The eggs are really the eggs are the things that are really the most in peril. These birds nest on the ground, so it's not like you have to be a good climber to reach these eggs. And also that means you're hiding your eggs basically on a 2D plane. If you're in the woods, predators have to look both 2D on the ground and 3D in the trees. So these really rely heavily on really good camouflage. And I mean, like, there have been so many times where I've been looking for nests and the nest is within 2 feet of where I'm standing. And I have spent, hours looking for it over the course of several days and still wasn't able to find it. But then every couple of minutes, the mom would come back and go right back to the nest. And, they hide their nest really well, which is a great strategy. If you're in the Midwest where it's just a sea of grass, kind of probability. If you hide your nest really well and there's grass everywhere, the chance of a predator coming into your section of grass is very low. In Vermont, it's a little more complicated because all of our grasslands, are generally near human settlements, especially farms. Farms have a lot of mice and grain and feed laying around. And so you have higher levels of skunks and raccoons and foxes and anything else around these human settlements. And so when you have the smaller field, because it's not, seas of grass, it's a 10-hectare field with increased levels of predators around it, because it's a human settlement. Those predation levels can be much higher. So it just kind of anything that comes across these eggs is a predator. Deer, white-tailed deer have been seen depredating grassland bird nests before. So really anything, if you come across 4 protein-filled eggs in the middle of the field on the ground, any animal will eat those. Snakes. We don't have lizards here, but I'm sure lizards in the proper environments. So a lot of things will depredate the eggs, and a lot of things will predate the adults.
I wonder if you might permit me to take a stab at answering a question about why meadowlarks and other grassland birds might be found on some farms but not others.
Yes.
And I think this gets back to what Kevin was talking about in different agricultural practices going back hundreds of years in Vermont. But from an economic standpoint, one of the things that's really changed in the dairy industry in the last 100 years is how you feed your animals and how you work your land. And there's a balance there. Back 100 years ago, it used to be more efficient to let the cows out and graze in a pasture and bring them back into milk during the summer. That way you didn't have to tend to the cows. They just sort of fed themselves all summer long out in the pasture. You just had to go bring them into the barn to milk them. And now it's become more economically feasible for farmers to keep their cows in the barn and just hay, which is to say mow all of their fields. And that for them allows them to use more, use their land to produce more hay and also manage their herd more effectively. So there's been this big transition in Vermont from a lot of pasture land, that is to say, hay fields that the cows are actively grazing on, to having cows in barns and just mowing as much field as you can, as often as you can. And so there's a great example of this. Kevin mentioned this site up in Highgate, Vermont, where there are a couple farms right next to each other, all in a row. And there's one farm that uses fairly old practices, or has used until recently fairly old practices of still putting their cows on a pasture and grazing them in the summer. So they let their cows out into the pasture, and 3 times a day they go out, they bring the cows back into the barn to milk them. And that mimics or mirrors the system in which a lot of these grassland birds evolved. If you think about the Great Plains, these birds evolved with large ungulates grazing. Think about bison. And that's sort of a system in which these birds are used to and can adapt to. But what they cannot adapt to are mowers and just mowing these huge swaths of field 3 times a summer. So that's an example of a farm where there's still this expansive pasture land where cows are grazing on it, and there are a high density of grassland birds there. The farm next door is mowing their fields, and the density of grassland birds on that farm is much lower. So that's when people are going birding and noticing, yeah, there's agricultural land, but there are grassland birds here, but not here. Those agricultural practices are really coming into play there, I think.
Yeah, and definitely, yeah, totally. And going off that too, grassland birds like older fields. So if you have a field that's been managed, the same way that one has been for, in Vermont, hundreds of years possibly, if you have a field that's 100 years old, that's going to be higher quality habitat than one that, was just converted from soybean to grass last year. So depending on how long a field has been habitat, and if it's a legacy field, and all this stuff, it's going to depend. And I also brought up on the screen here, I mentioned that all habitat for grassland birds is on a continuum. So if you have, too much leaf litter, but the grass is too short, it just for meadowlarks or bobolinks. So it also just comes down to all forests have different tree compositions. All grasslands have different parameters that have to be just so in the Goldilocks zone for these grassland birds to call them, quality breeding areas.
Yeah, and thinking back into historic agricultural practices, there was the idea of the fallow field, where you would have some rotational grazing of your cows to maintain this sort of pasture. And you would have a series of pastures, and some would be grazed in some years, and then there would be an off year where that pasture was let to rest so that that grass could grow without being munched on. And that was a way that farmers who didn't have tons of machinery could maintain their soil and their grass, and still have the cows out. The idea of a fallow field now is just a foreign concept in our mechanized age of dairy farming. I mean, really, in order to make a living, farmers have to use every square foot of land they possibly can. And it's a very unfortunate situation they're sort of put into. I've got just a couple more questions. One more specifically about the process, and then I think we'll sort of wrap up.
Cool.
A question about what to do with incidental sightings, and then what to do with encounters of other grassland birds and good habitat, but no meadowlarks.
Yeah, so anytime you see a meadowlark this year, or ever, but this year, get it on eBird, even if it's incidental. It's a big thing to get all this data, and we have, this whole protocol set up and stuff. But a big part of it too is just, outreach, getting the word out there, making sure that this map is from 10 years of eBird data. That's insane. This is so much hours of field work that would not be possible without people putting these data on eBird. So this is as much about getting awareness and getting people to eBird stuff and making them ambassadors for grassland birds, as it is sticking to this formal protocol. So any incidental thing, throw them up on eBird. At the end of the year, I'll probably just do a big data dump, and then I'll overlay eBird sightings, maybe to town, and then I can reach out to all the towns that have meadowlarks there, showing them where the fields are and trying to work out something for conserving them. So even if it's an incidental report, just that presence data is so important. And similarly, if you don't encounter any meadowlarks, enter it in eBird with a count of 0. Because 0 data is as, if not more important than presence data. You can never definitively say that this is, devoid of meadowlarks. You can't prove absence. But if you don't detect anything for 3 times over the summer, it's a pretty safe bet that there's not going to be meadowlarks there, and put a 0 value in because you looked for them, you couldn't find them. And now we at least know someone looked here, they couldn't find any. Best try somewhere else, reallocate your time somewhere else. And a lot of times, 0 data is to eBird, or, just aren't that no one likes putting 0 data in. And like with scientific papers, usually if you don't have significant results, a lot of people just might not publish that paper. So someone might try redoing the same science project because they don't know that it's not worth it. So if you do see other grassland birds, I'm telling people to focus only on the meadowlarks. That being said, with the quality of so many of the Vermont birders, I'm not too concerned about them getting overwhelmed by other birds and not be able to focus on meadowlark. So still, at least note presence with an X. If you don't get caught up trying to count every single bobolink, but estimate, you know, is there one or is there 10 or are there 300? So just kind of like a rough estimate would be awesome. If you want to try and count them all, totally fine. Just try not to let that distract you too much from the meadowlarks. If you come across a rare bird, Vesper sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, upland sandpiper, sedge wren, or uppy, basically any of the birds that are listed, any of these 4 guys, and also the Vesper sparrow, you know, shooting me an email would be great, but I'm pretty sure this summer I'll be living on eBird a lot of the time. So I'll probably do like daily checks on data entry. So hopefully I'll see it. But if you do see like a grasshopper sparrow singing, yeah, shoot me an email. I'd love to come out there and check it out with you. I remember when I was working for the Bobbling Project or the Bobbling Odyssey at Shelburne, there was one male grasshopper sparrow that was there like all summer. And I finally saw it and I put it on eBird. And the next day, a member of the Endangered Species Committee was out looking for it. So like this stuff is good to know. It's really important to know as soon as possible. And yeah, throw it on eBird. Feel free to email me, and I'll hopefully be able to see anything like that.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for sharing all about this awesome new project. And I really hope that folks can get out there and do some grassland bird surveying.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for staying, you know, an extra half hour and letting me yabber on. Email me grasslands@VT Ecostudies for any of your grassland conservation or survey needs. I'm always eager to talk about that. It's hopefully what I'll be doing every day this summer is getting out there. So I'd love to get you guys, you know, more involved. If you or a friend has grasslands, even if you already are managing for birds, just let me know. I can always handle getting out of the office to check out a grassland. So I'm more than happy to come visit you at some point.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Kevin, and thank all of you for joining us.